Hi, I'm Susan Cauley, and welcome to You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability. The ultimate goal and challenge for parents planning the future of their child with autism is to have them build, sustain, and live fulfilling lives. Joining us today in this conversation is Susan Loring, Director for the Autism Resource Center, and Kathy Boyle, President of Autism Housing Pathways. At what age should parents begin to plan for the future of their child with autism, and where should they start?
Well, I think probably at the point of diagnosis, you have to begin to plan for the future. And like any child, you don't know what that future might entail, but to begin to think, because the child has a disability, that you might have to make alternate plans. And we're hopeful that the ABLE Act will be passed federally so that parents can begin to put money away. Like you save for college, you could save for your child who has a disability. So I would advise parents to begin saving as much as possible at the outset, because it's costly to house somebody for the rest of their lives, and it's costly for all the services that they might need in the future, not to mention an enjoyable life.
Right. What is the ABLE Act?
The ABLE Act is a new piece of legislation that allows families to save. You could not save for your child with a disability. If they had more than $2,000 in savings, you would lose your Social Security benefits. So now that the ABLE Act, the idea is to allow families to save proactively for the future so that their child can have an enviable life, even, that they'll have what they need, as opposed to living in poverty on what SSI and Social Security can provide for them, so that that $2,000 cap will no longer stand.
Okay. So how do you feel about when you should start beginning to save?
As early as possible. Realistically, the unemployment rate among adults with autism is 80 to 90%, and that includes individuals with Asperger's syndrome. So even if you think your child is on an academic track, if they're going to graduate from college, they may still be in a situation where they need help with housing. And just as you would save for college, you want to save for housing. And you know, particularly in Massachusetts, where housing costs are high, you would hope to have, based on the current market, you know, $25,000 to $45,000 saved up for a down payment.
That's very difficult, though, for people on a budget.
It is. The good news, compared to where parents were 20 years ago, is that there is insurance coverage for a lot of therapies at this point, whereas when my son was younger, I was paying, you know, $75 a week for speech therapy.
Right.
Now that would be covered by insurance other than a copay, and so I would have been able to put some of that away. The other thing we tell families is this is a team effort. My son could not care less about really expensive toys. It could be make a lot more sense to ask the grandparents, instead of paying for the really expensive toy, would you put away $25 or $50 a month?
That's a great idea. Now, what else should you have in a future plan besides the financial aspect of it and housing? Is there anything else that should be in that plan for your daughter or son?
Working on skills of daily living. Again, this is something that is not necessarily emphasized sufficiently in a lot of school settings, and also, again, for individuals who are on more of an academic track, it tends to get lost in the shuffle frequently.
Right.
But you know, your child may be absolutely brilliant, but
social cues and social etiquette and things of that nature. Is
well, beyond that, what will they do if the toilet gets clogged? You know, can they shower independently? Do they always wear clothes that are appropriate for the season?
That's very true.
All of these are necessary. Can they do grocery shopping? Can they navigate mass transit on their own? All of those are necessary for independent living. And if you're in a situation that many people are, where they're not going to be eligible for a lot of supportive services, you're going to have to pay for those things out of pocket. And the more skills your child has, the less it's going to cost you.
Okay. Now, how do you start advocating for the future for your child with autism at like an IEP meeting when they start going to school?
Well, I think that, you want to not just focus on the academics. The academics are great, but recognize that our children don't learn those things that everybody else just sort of picks up along the way. It's sort of called the hidden curriculum. And so build in that sort of concrete teaching of skills that every other kid just sort of laps up off the floor.
Right.
Our kids don't, so they need that, and so you sort of go where the kid is at and what's appropriate for a child that age to know how to do, and try and teach them that. And you may find that the gap between what your child can do and what a child that age typically can do can widen as time goes by, because it takes our kids longer to acquire, hold, and master those skills, that you're always playing catch up.
Right.
So I think that if you begin early, making sure that that isn't forgotten.
As soon as they are diagnosed.
Because your educators tend to focus just on the education,
Right.
So you've got to be the one that's advocating for that piece for your child and make sure that it gets built in. They're entitled to that in an IEP.
Oh, great.
And the more that you do that, the better off they're going to be when they get to be an adult and they don't have the entitlements of an IEP, they have an ISP.
Right. Now let's talk about a little bit about what the difference is between an ISP and an IEP. Who wants to elaborate on that?
I'm going to assume that, I shouldn't assume that the listeners know what an IEP is. It's an individual education plan,
Correct.
which is devised by a team of educators, parents, and other disciplines to address the needs of somebody with special needs. So that happens in the school, and it's an entitlement, and there's regulations about it, there's timelines, there's laws behind it, and if it doesn't go well, you can challenge it, you can litigate to get what your child needs. An ISP takes over when your child enters the Department of Developmental Services, if your child enters.
Okay.
Okay? So we've
What
just
happens if
passed-
your child doesn't enter the DDS system?
They may be eligible for Mass Rehab
Rehab.
Commission. There's this thing called the 688 process, which is the referral for adult services. 688 refers to Chapter 688, which is a state law. And basically, there are a number of agencies that are considered sort of destination agencies for adults. DDS is one, Mass Rehab Commission is another, Commission for the Blind is another, Commission
Department of Mental Health.
Hearing, Department of Mental
Do you
Health.
always qualify for one of these?
No.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yes, you can fall completely through the cracks and not qualify for anything.
And we've just sort of closed those cracks by expanding the eligibility for the Department of Developmental Services. It was passed this past summer in a bill, but the regulations aren't out yet, and there are people who in the past were probably denied that can now reapply, but there are going to be people who are still not going to fall into the services for DDS.
Correct. And there are also people who do qualify for Mass Rehab, but Mass Rehab does not have a strong background in autism. They are working to build that up, but it is still a problem where people can be referred to Mass Rehab, but Mass Rehab is not really in a position to give them the kinds of assistance that they need.
Now, what happens if, at what point should you be looking into whether you qualify for DDS or these other services? I mean, is that something that you need to do?
Children with an
Fairly
autism
soon?
diagnosis can qualify for DDS up until the age of 18, and there's two categories of eligibility. One is the standard DDS child disability services that a family supports. The other is the autism division, which was put into DDS about, what do you want to say, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, sometime back. And the autism division families are served through the 7 autism centers across the state, which I'm the director for the one for Central Mass. So the center for this area is the North Shore ARCS Autism Support Center up in Danvers. So the centers have huge areas that they're covering, and we're covering, like, I have close to 3,000 families that are registered with us.
Wow.
And people who are autism division eligible may apply for limited services through the centers. People who are dually eligible, children's and autism division, can, utilize the center, but they also have a case manager through DDS who can help them in times of crisis. Typically, when the axe falls on the budget, family supports is one of the first things that gets cut, because families are the best bargain that the state has. We provide for our family member, and it doesn't matter if we're not going to get support. We're not going to go throw them out.
Now, if they don't get support.
The other thing I would say is with the 6088 process, the referral has to come from the school district. The parent cannot make the referral themselves. So you are going to need to press your district, once your child is getting to be 16, 17, 18, 19, to make that 688 referral. Now, that does not mean that you shouldn't start to look at transition issues until that point. Under federal law, once a child is 14, you need to start to look at transition in the context of the IEP. And that's particularly important because all of those skills, those daily living skills we were talking about, take years to get into place and to for students to become fluent. And there's one really nice resource that people should be aware of. If they want to Google the Adolescent Autonomy Checklist, that is, it is exactly what it says. It's a checklist of skills that your young adult should have, and it covers everything from what to do if a circuit breaker is tripped to how to make coffee.
Oh, that's interesting.
And these are exactly the kinds of skills people need to learn to live independently.
Because autistic children and adults don't have that capability all the time to rationalize things and to figure things out.
And people also need to bear in mind that the school districts are obligated to help people master those skills. That they cannot simply say it's not academics, we don't do that.
Right.
And finally, to remember that you do not have to accept a diploma until a child is 22.
Okay. Now, to switch a little bit about what we've been talking about, do you think parents of children who are autistic should become guardians for their child? And when should this take place?
I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, because one person with autism, one person with autism. So I think it's something that parents really need to look at, and there's some things about future programs that you need to know before you make that decision to become guardians. That there are some services that you can tap into that if you're both guardians, you can't. And so families need to know that if you want to tap into adult family care, one can be the guardian, the other is reserved to be the staff person for that.
Care provider, yes.
Care provider. So it's
what happens if
important to
you're
know
only
these
a
things.
single parent, though?
That's very difficult.
That's
where people start to say, well, maybe a sibling who's over the 18 can become the caregiver, or maybe the parent can be a caregiver and an aunt or an uncle can be the guardian. But it is very tricky.
That's interesting. I never knew that.
But I think those decisions all come around that transition time. At 14, you begin thinking about transition. At 16, if you think that your child's going to need guardianship, you need to start thinking about the testing that's going to be required to submit to the court for guardianship, because sometimes there can be a 1-year wait to get an appointment.
Oh my
and you
goodness.
need to have it within a year of when you're sitting down for guardianship.
6 months.
6 months?
Yes, it's it's a 180 day window. Before the birthday, the testing has to be dated. And the testing has to be done by a doctor, a social worker, and a psychologist.
And those are all three separate reports?
Yes.
Yes. But they have to all be dated the same date, or the court will throw it back at you.
You're kidding?
No.
So what do they have to do? Coordinate?
You have to coordinate it.
And have them all like in the same place at the same time?
It depends. I mean, it's the date of the report. It's not necessarily the date of the exam. So in my son's case, the assessment was done by the social worker and the doctor at the same time because they were in the same practice together. They waited to get the report from the psychologist, looked at the date on the psychologist report, and dated their report on that date.
Little tricky things that,
Wow. There's a lot to this.
It's been 12 years since I did guardianship. I'm thinking within the year.
Yeah.
But those are the sorts of things that people start to have to think about around 16, 17, is setting up those appointments. And also at that time you had asked, children's coverage for autism ends at age 18.
Right.
So your child has to qualify for adult services at age 18.
At 18.
It doesn't mean that they're going to get services until 22, because the
Right.
school will cover till 22.
That's a tricky thing too. Anyway, another question that I have for you is, what is the role of an occupational therapist after they turn 22 versus before they turn 22?
Well, it's going to, obviously it's going to depend on the individual. I mean, my son needs a sensory diet all the time. He's going to need a sensory diet the rest of his life.
Right.
And his, he is served through a rehabilitation program, which is a medical model, and therefore there's occupational therapy consulting within the context of that day program. Obviously we carry that over into his residential setting to make sure he's got the inputs that he needs. But people don't magically change when they turn 22. If they need something, they need something.
Right.
And many times children's need for occupational therapy, for those on the more able end of the spectrum, sort of fades as their neurological system matures and they no longer need it. But some who, live like Ed and Terry at the other end of the spectrum may need some assistance throughout their lives.
Now, let's go back to the housing issues. What types of housing situations are available to individuals after they turn 22?
Again, it depends on the individual. If someone is eligible for supports through DDS, in general, about 30 to 33% of the DDS turning 22 class receives residential services at age 22. Up until the last few months, that number has really only been about 12 or 13% of people with autism, because there was an IQ cutoff for DDS services. Because of the new law that changes eligibility, people with an IQ above 70 may, emphasis on may, now be eligible, because while the IQ cutoff is no longer there, they still have to meet a functional criteria.
Assessment,
but you'll notice that's a percentage. That's not 100% of the DDS 22 caseload is eligible for 24/7 residential supports at that point. What DDS does is they use what's called a health and safety criteria. So if an individual is, if it is considered that the individual cannot be healthy and safe living in the family home after 22, then they'll be prioritized. So about a third of the people who get residential supports when they turn 22 are wards of the state and have no family involvement. The rest who received residential supports at that point, 24/7 residential support at that time, are the people who meet this health and safety criteria. And there are three kinds of living situations you're commonly going to see through DDS. One is the classic group home, which may be 4 or 5 individuals. Another is shared living, where up to 3 individuals with a disability live with a caregiver, either in the home of the caregiver or in a home of the home of the people, individuals with disabilities. Historically, DDS has leaned more heavily on the group home model, but they are trying to move towards the shared living model. They feel it is more integrated into the community and it's less costly.
And then back up for a minute. I'm not clear about the shared living situation. Is that there are like 2 or 3 people that live in somebody's home?
Yes.
It could also be just one person.
Frequently it is just one, but the way the regulation is written, it's
but
anywhere
somebody
from
else
1 to
besides
3.
their parents.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
My son's in a shared living placement.
I see. Okay.
And so he lives with another family a couple of miles from us. And he's that parent, that's a 2-parent family, and that mom, that's her job, is my son. And she does a great job at it, and is a huge support to me and to Ed.
And the shared living providers receive a stipend from the state, and they are always looking for more shared living providers.
Absolutely.
Now, the third setting I was going to mention, which is not likely to happen at 22 unless someone is a ward of the state, is, you know, the individual who can live pretty much independently with some supports in an apartment. And an individual who has family involvement is not going to be prioritized for that at 22. So it's really only going to apply to people with no family involvement who turn 22.
No family involvement meaning they're homeless or
their parents may be out of the picture. There may be no family. The parents may be out of the picture legally.
Okay.
You know, again, people who are wards of the state when they turn 22.
Okay.
And so, again, historically, that's been about 12–13% of people with autism when they turn 22. It's not clear how that percentage is going to change over the next few years because they're changing the eligibility requirements. Now, for people who do not fit into that model, there is, Sue already mentioned, adult family care, which is also called adult foster care. It is very similar to shared living in a lot of ways, in that, you know, 1, 2, or 3 individuals live with a caregiver, either in the home of the individual or individuals, or in the home of the provider, and that provider receives a stipend. The difference is the amount of the stipend and where the money's coming from. In shared living, the stipend is larger and is paid by DDS. In adult family care or adult foster care, the stipend is considerably smaller and is paid by Mass Health. Now, the important thing to remember about AFC, and the only difference between family care and foster care is who's the caregiver. If a family member is the caregiver, it's called adult family care. If it's not a family member who's the caregiver, it's called adult foster care. But otherwise, it's the same program.
Wow.
So to qualify, you need at least prompting with at least one activity of daily living. There's a higher stipend if you need physical assistance with 3 or more activities of daily living or with 2 activities plus a behavior. And according to a survey we did, about 40% of adults with autism will meet the criteria for adult foster care. There's another 40% who will not, but cannot live independently.
I see. So what do you suggest for parents when they look at all of this? Do you think that they have a choice? A lot of times if their child is functional and they're, you know, they don't qualify for any services, that they will have to live at home?
There are not as many options as there should be. If you fall into the category of someone who does not qualify for AFC, but you can't live independently, unless the family is able to afford some kind of, you know, out-of-home setting, or the individual qualifies for public housing or is able to get into some other kind of affordable housing, it's difficult. You have a lot of people who fall into the category of needing what's called life coaching, which is about $100 an hour.
Oh my goodness.
And a lot of people can get by with only an hour a week.
Yeah.
But still, if you need to pay rent on an apartment and pay for an hour a week of life coaching, you know, you're talking about $1,500 a month out of pocket.
Right, and that's
you know, which is way too much for a lot of people.
If you're living on SSI, you don't have that.
No.
And if you're living on SSI, you don't have it. So there's several things people really need to bear in mind. It is extremely important that as soon as your child turns 18, that they apply for a Section 8 housing voucher, because there may be a 5 to 10 or even 12-year wait to get a voucher.
Wow.
So if you want your child to move out of your home by the time they're 30, you need to be on that waiting list as soon as they turn 18. They have to be 18 to get on the list.
Okay. Moving on a little bit from the housing issue, what other services will be required for a child who is turning 22 and becomes a young adult? What other services do, besides housing, what about food and all of that?
Typically, so if your child is served by an agency in a group home or in shared living, 3/4 of their Social
Right.
Security
Social
is
Security
given
goes.
to the program, so that leaves them about 150 thereabouts for their toiletries, for entertainment, for clothing, for shoes, anything
Which isn't
else.
really a lot of money.
Not a whole lot of money,
for
no.
a whole month.
No, it's not. So typically, in that placement, your food is included,
Right.
you know, and your heat and that sort of thing. So there's not those issues to worry about.
Okay.
I think that for people who are trying to make it on their own, you know, there's no way you can do it on what you're going to be given
Right.
to
Right.
exist on.
And that's where several things come into play. Just as a quick footnote, food stamps are one of the only ways that you can get financial assistance without reducing your Social Security benefits. You cannot use food stamps if you're in adult foster care or adult family care, however.
Oh my goodness.
So basically, we have something we call a Turning 18 checklist. It's available on our website, autismhousingpathways.net. And the big ones that people need to do is obviously they need to apply for SSI as an adult. Once they receive SSI, they are automatically eligible for Mass Health. Mass Health is extremely important because it's the main way of paying for long-term services and supports.
Okay.
Mass Health pays for adult foster care or personal care attendant services, for instance. It's extremely important, if they have any control over the matter, that parents not retire before the child is receiving SSI as an adult. Because if the child is receiving SSDI, based on the parent's work history as an adult, and they're not already on SSI as an adult, they are not necessarily going to get Mass Health. They can still qualify for Common Health, but it's a very complicated process.
Right.
And this is all, I mean, we could get very deep into the weeds on this. I'm not
Yeah,
going to do that, but what I'm
okay.
going to say is that we have 2-hour workshops, introductory housing workshops, that we strongly recommend families, if they've got a 15, 16, 17-year-old, that is certainly old enough to come to one of those, and certainly if your child is older than that, you really ought to be attending one of those workshops.
Right. And where are the workshops?
We hold them around the state.
All over.
All around the state?
Yes.
Okay, that's something that
So you have one coming
parents.
up
Yes.
in Natick?
Yes, I'm doing one in Natick tomorrow night,
Okay.
and one of our volunteers is doing one in Lexington tonight.
Now, what happens once parents are no longer able to advocate for their child, who is now an adult with autism? Like, for instance, they're retired, or they are physically not able to, have their child at home, or, I mean, what happens when the parents are either not able to or are not alive anymore? What happens to the child with autism, or the adult with autism, as I might say?
Well, I think, there's always that hope that if there's siblings, that they will step in. If one parent passes away, then perhaps a sibling takes on the co-guardianship, so that you have, that training time that you can instill those skills in advocacy and what the system is in the child, the second child, the sibling.
Right.
But, there are families that don't have a sibling who's
Right.
capable, and at that point, they may need to look at finding a guardian for them that can do that. There are
And they can set
people
that
out
up
there.
prior to
their demise.
And it's
or
very
whatever.
important that parents have what's called a letter of intent.
Yep.
Yes.
And families should also look hard at doing person-centered planning to try to put together what are called circles of support. Things can be very overwhelming if you're relying on one person, but if you can try to put together a team of people where this person is responsible for picking somebody up and taking them out to dinner once every 2 weeks, that person goes bowling with them once a week.
So there's a lot of planning involved in the whole process.
There is, and it's, a lot of times people tend to go at transition thinking I'm going to do it once and we'll live
Right.
happily ever after, and that's
It's
not the
not
case. It's not the
true.
case for anybody. You know, we all go through different transitions, different periods in our life, and the same holds true for our sons and daughters who have autism. And you know, so you sort of have to look at and hopefully plan so that there's somebody there for the long run for them to help with that.
Right. Well, I thank you, Susan and Catherine, for this conversation and future planning for individuals with autism. And I am glad that you came today. Hope you found this two-part discussion on autism constructive and supportive. Join us next time on You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability.